Francis, does the theory of evolution, which everyone should accept, does it require biologists to be agnostics or atheists if they are to have a coherent worldview?
Obviously, this is a fundamental question for anybody who's aware of what's happening in biology. Certainly, evolution as a way of explaining the relatedness of living things is no longer in question. The data, somewhat from the fossil record, but more recently from the study of DNA, is incontrovertible. You can't look at that evidence and not conclude that living things, including ourselves, are all related by descent from a common ancestor. So that's the facts. What does that say about whether or not God was involved? It says nothing at all. It says this was the means by which creation occurred. But did God have a hand in starting that process? I believe he did. And I believe that basically this choice between atheism and agnosticism and belief is influenced in a certain way. Perhaps it limits the number of kinds of alternatives, but it in no way forces one into one of those boxes. And certainly, science is about the natural world. If God has any meaning, God is outside the natural world, at least in part. And so science really can't comment upon whether or not God exists, for which reason I think atheism is the least logical of the choices. Left then between agnosticism and belief, one's decision ultimately comes down not from the study of evolution or any other branch of science, but from other aspects of trying to decide, is it reasonable that there is a God, and if so, that he cares about you and me? I've come to the conclusion that it's more reasonable to say that than to say, I don't know, or that I know he's not there.
Some would say that the more we understand the mechanistic processes from biology and then chemistry and then physics and then fundamental theory beneath that, that you have a hierarchy of relationships, of causal relationships that leaves no room for God. There's no room for some intervention in this process because it all flows so naturally.
So, Robert, I think the things that science has taught us have perhaps made us more and more clear that the kind of God we should not embrace is a God of the gaps. That we ought not to identify things that we can't quite yet understand in the natural world and say, oh, that must be where God is.
Right.
We've made that mistake down through time. Some are making it today, frankly, in the theory of intelligent design, which I think falls into that same category. Those are not places that we ought to try to box God in. But having said all of that, there are fundamental questions about not the how, but the why, that science is powerless to answer. And we are still left with this question about why is there something instead of nothing? And how did the universe begin, given that I don't think matter has been seen to create itself in the same way that we understood happened 13.7 billion years ago. And we have the fine-tuning of the universe to try to understand why is it that all of these constants have exactly the value that they do to make it possible for coalescence of matter and life itself to occur. So there's plenty of room there to postulate a need for God if one is open to that idea without boxing him into some small aspect of physics, chemistry, or biology, or cosmology, which clearly is going to be an unproductive way to explore belief or unbelief.
As I hear what you're saying, you're looking at other factors of grand nature. Why is there something rather than nothing? The cause of the Big Bang and the origin, the fine-tuning of the universe. These are massive things. They are not the structure of biology or the structure of chemistry that causes the biology. So you would say that in terms of the scientific explanation of biology, it is entirely a physical process that makes no comment about God, neither proving nor disproving. Is that correct?
That's basically right. I think what science teaches us about biology is established well enough that a believer or an unbeliever can accept it as true or not. Let me say, though, that as a believer who sees God's hand in the whole thing, not in this God of the gaps way, but in the way of starting the entire process with a goal in mind, and who knew what that goal was going to be even before it was possible for anyone trapped in time to have guessed it, that it is possible to look at the scientific evidence in a somewhat different way. If I was an atheist, well, it would be what it is. But for me as a believer, it is also a glimpse into the magnificence of God's mind, into his phenomenal ability to use mathematics and physics and chemistry and biology and cosmology and all these sciences to achieve a particularly elegant outcome. And in that regard, science, which is all about discovery, that's what gets us up in the morning, is trying to discover something new, can be, for a believer, also an occasion of seeking something about God's mind. Even if you'll accept the word, even an occasion of worship, where by discovering these things about the natural world, we are appreciating in a small little way, a little bit more about God's grandeur.
Does the God you describe be an intelligence that put the whole thing in process, designing the mathematics through chemistry, physics, and biology, and therefore have no need for continuous intervention of any kind?
Not at all. That would be a deist God, a God who sort of started the whole thing in motion, went, well, that was nice. Look at what I've done here with all of these amazing aspects of science. Now I'll do something else. You can certainly worship that kind of a God in an amazement of what he did. And of course, many scientists have taken that tack. I think that would be Einstein's God, for instance. But then you really have to ask the question, is that good enough? Does that explain everything? Does that satisfy your longing for the truth? For me, I went through that phase, and it didn't stop there, because there's other aspects of who we are as human beings that seem to cry out for some further explanation than simply nuts and bolts and atoms and molecules. And particularly this uniquely aspect of being human, this knowledge of right and wrong, this spiritual nature, which evolution, in my view, can have provided some of the ground for, but not the whole thing. And when I seek that kind of information, and I look into my own heart, and I find things like this longing to do right, even though I often don't succeed in doing so, that puzzles me. And as C.S. Lewis has argued very effectively, and I think that's one of the most thoughtful approaches to a rational perspective about a personal God, if you were looking for evidence of a personal God, and you found this thing within yourself that you couldn't easily explain, and it seemed to be there in other human beings as well, wouldn't that be an interesting kind of signpost? I find that compelling. It doesn't prove anything, but it is enough to open your eyes to the possibility that the deist God may be selling God short, that God had a bit more in mind than this. There was more of a purpose, and part of the purpose, maybe, was us.